The Senate Judiciary Committee is holding its first hearing on voting rights since the Democrats last controlled the Senate. As chair of the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights Subcommittee, I had a series of hearings about a wave of voter suppression laws then under consideration across the country. Sadly, the situation is much worse today. I'd like to start with a video showing how far the fight for democracy has come and the progress we have yet to make.
Those who founded our country knew that freedom would be secure only if each generation fought to renew and enlarge its meaning. Americans of every race and color have worked to build a nation of widening opportunities. Now, our generation of Americans has been called on to continue the unending search for justice within our own borders. We can understand how this all happened, but it cannot continue.
We must say, wake up, America, wake up, for we cannot stop.
When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
We hold these truths
to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Yet millions are being deprived of those blessings.
Legislative measures limiting ballot access are now moving through 47 state houses right now.
The new law, for example, prevents anyone but a poll worker from handing out water or food to voters waiting in those notoriously long lines that are much more common in counties with larger black and brown populations.
And look throughout history, and you will know that what is taking place today is a new
Jim Crow in a suit and tie.
We all know that this is not a Democratic or Republican issue. It is an American one.
We have got to have federal protections.
The John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
To make sure that we are expanding the protection of voters, the right to vote in this country.
And I will fight until the death to make sure every citizen has that right to vote.
If not us, then who? If not now, then when? The arc of the world universe is so long, but it bends toward justice.
It is deadly wrong to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
Our work is not finished.
Since our nation's founding, there's been an intractable conflict between champions of democracy and defenders of white supremacy. In 1890, white supremacists won a victory that would inspire a generation of legislation to deny full citizenship to black Americans. They called it the Mississippi Plan. Historian Carol Anderson, who's one of today's witnesses, has described it as, quote, a dizzying array of poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, newfangled voter registration rules, good character clauses, all intentionally racially discriminatory but dressed up in the garb of bringing integrity to voting. The president of the state constitutional convention that spawned the Mississippi Plan, S.S. Calhoun, announced, and I quote, "Let's tell the truth if it burst the bottom of the universe. We came here to exclude the Negro. Nothing short of this will answer." And they succeeded. 3 years later, a local newspaper reported that about 94% of black men in Mississippi who were eligible to vote under the old Constitution would no longer be eligible under new rules. In the words of one reporter, it marked, quote, practical elimination of the majority race from the politics of the state. What happened in Mississippi did not stay in Mississippi. By 1910, states including South Carolina, Louisiana, North Carolina, Alabama, Virginia, Georgia, and Oklahoma had adopted statutes that sought to emulate Mississippi's success in systematically suppressing black voters. By the late 20th century, the federal government recognized these laws, passed during the Jim Crow era, amounted to a national crisis of voter disenfranchisement. Many of the most egregious voter suppression tactics were outlawed by civil rights legislation in the 1960s. But the insidious effort to suppress the right of voters of color has evolved and continued, most recently through a scourge of voter suppression laws introduced in state capitals across America. Just this year, more than 360 bills with restrictive voting provisions have been introduced in 47 states. These new pieces of legislation may not involve literacy tests or counting the number of jelly beans in a jar like the original Jim Crow. But make no mistake, they are a deliberate effort to suppress voters of color. This is the reality of our political landscape following the Supreme Court's Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. Some of the new proposed laws requires voters to show ID and cut back early voting. One Texas bill would make it a felony for election officials to distribute absentee ballot applications. The law that's received the most attention in recent weeks is the one that Georgia's governor signed last month. It'll make it harder for Georgians to vote early or by absentee ballot, and make it a crime to offer water to voters waiting in line. It wasn't long ago that an American could be barred from voting for failing to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar. Now they might not be able to vote because they're stuck in a lengthy line on a hot day, and they can't even receive a drink of water from a Good Samaritan. Why are states like Georgia making it harder for Americans to exercise our most fundamental right? The response from proponents of these laws is that they help maintain the integrity of the election system, another tactic taken straight from the Mississippi Plan playbook. But President Trump's officials at the Department of Homeland Security declared that the 2020 election was the most secure election in American history. Some of my colleagues on this committee were on the same ballot as President Trump, and they're willing to accept the results that showed their re-elections valid. So if our elections are secure, these laws aren't really about integrity. What is the problem that lawmakers in Georgia want to address with the new law? The problem is obvious. Too many voters are showing up. Georgia law saw historic voter turnout during the last election. Among Georgia voters who returned absentee ballots, we get an answer to our question. 65% of those who returned absentee ballots voted for President Biden, 35% for Donald Trump. It seems Republican lawmakers in Georgia have concluded that the solution to their election problems is to make it harder to vote, because the voters who did vote in the last election were not their voters. That is fundamentally un-American. In the words of Senator Warnock, and thank you for joining us today, it is democracy in reverse. In our republic, politicians don't choose our voters, the voters choose us. We ought to enact legislation that makes it easy as possible to vote while ensuring our elections are safe and secure. There are a number of steps Congress can take to advance this goal, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and enshrining an affirmative right to vote in the United States Constitution. I went back today to read the transcript and the reporting of the transcript of the January 2nd telephone conversation between President Donald Trump and Secretary of State of Georgia, Mr. Raffensperger. It was recorded. There is no doubt what was said in that conversation. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, was explicit. Here's what he said. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have. The president, who had 17 days left in his administration, hinted that Mr. Raffensperger and Ryan Germany, the chief lawyer of the Secretary of State's office, could be prosecuted criminally if they did not do his bidding. Here's what the president said. You know what they did, and you're not reporting it, he said. You know that's a criminal offense, and you know you can't let this happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk, the President of the United States said in a conversation that was recorded. It's no surprise that this president goes on to claim not only several conspiracy theories, including debunked charges that ballots in Fulton County, Georgia were shredded, that voting machines were operated by Dominion voting systems tampered with and replaced. And Mr. Germany in this conversation can be heard telling the president that such charges are flatly untrue, even as Trump insists otherwise. You want to have an accurate election, and you're a Republican, Mr. Trump told Mr. Raffensperger. Mr. Raffensperger replied, "We believe that we do have an accurate election." Trump responded, "No, no, no, you don't have, not even close. You guys are off by hundreds of thousands of votes." I reread that to think for a moment about this state election official, Mr. Raffensperger in Georgia, who had the foresight to tape that conversation so that history would be clear, but also made it clear that an election where nearly 5 million votes were cast, the notion that they could find 11,780 votes, as President Trump requested, was just plain wrong. Of all the absentee votes, of all the votes in person, of all the activities that took place before and after the election, Raffensperger refused to concede that point. Well, I can tell you it cost him, because when it came time to pass the new laws, the Georgia legislature, signed into law by the Georgia governor, stripped the Secretary of State, Mr. Raffensperger's position, of his power to preside over the state election board. He paid a heavy price for being honest and courageous in that conversation with President Trump. The Secretary of State is also removed under this new Georgia law as a voting member of the state election board. Clearly, a majority of those who voted in the Georgia legislature were out to send Mr. Raffensperger a message that if you don't take the Trump line and follow it and allege that you found some votes that weren't counted or counted improperly, you'll pay a price for it. That is what we're up against here, and that's why this hearing is taking place. One of my heroes and friends and former colleagues, John Lewis, said, "The vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It's the most powerful, nonviolent tool in a democracy." Well, recent efforts to prevent Americans from participating in our democracy remind us how much work remains to protect this precious, almost sacred right. Now I'll turn to Ranking Member Grassley for